Hi, I'm Bill Woodard, and welcome to Inside Smith County. In our second episode of Inside Smith County, we had the privilege of talking with Mr. James Bass of Bass & Bass Attorneys, located on Main Street here in Carthage, Tennessee. They're members of our local chamber and supporters of the community. Mr. Bass shared with us some of his life experiences and things that happened during the early days of Smith County, and also while he was a veteran in World War II. So I think you'll enjoy this episode with Mr. James Bass.
My name is James L. Bass. I'm 93 years of age. I was born in New Middleton in 1921. And at the time I was born, New Middleton was no different from all of the other communities in Smith County. It was a small center of business, of people coming to town to shop, especially on Friday afternoon and Saturday. It was almost a self-contained town. You could get almost anything that you would need, at least on a daily basis, there in one of the stores, or at least by the next day, the merchant could have it. And that was no different from the rest of the communities in the county. All were self-contained communities where all of the groceries, dry goods, farming equipment, plows, plow points, whatever you needed was available. In addition to the towns, there were the roadside markets, the grocery stores between the automobile service stations. It was a way of life that was quite different from what we see now. But my early life was there in New Middleton. I have recollections back as far as the very early 1920s. My sister died when I was hardly 4 years of age, and I have several recollections of things that happened prior to her death. So my memory can relate back beyond until the early 20s. I could relate a lot of personal experiences that happened back in those early days, but I suppose that I could mention a couple. Believe it or not, I remember the first day I went to school. I remember going to school. I remember my mother taking me. I remember the classroom we were in, and I remember a little bit of pandemonium. And of course, at that time, the schools were crowded, as you would imagine. So we were in the period there of trying to get organized. But I do remember that first day of school. Another thing I remember in those days was when Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic. We were all geared to the radio, hearing that he was going to land in Paris. And as I recall, there were no transatlantic communications back then, but the announcer in New York was able to relay the excitement that was taking place over in Paris. The thing that would really highlight, I suppose, the 1920s was the stock market crash. I remember the stock market crash. It did not mean a lot to me. I did not know anything about stocks or Wall Street or any of the financial things that were taking place in New York. What I related to was the fact that when the stock market crashed, it also caused several of the smaller banks in the communities to close. And I had my very, very meager bank account in one of the banks that closed. And I had a difficult time understanding why I couldn't go to the bank and draw my meager funds out of the bank. And of course, my funds being as meager as they were, I received no pro rata payment when the settlement came. In the 20s, I also remember a Rose Bowl game. Alabama went to the Rose Bowl to play USC, Southern California. I remember a World Series game on radio between the Philadelphia A's and the Chicago Cubs. And I remember some of the early home run practices of Babe Ruth. It was quite a thrill back then on the baseball circuit because he was hitting the home runs. I have very many memories of the 1930s. The big thing in the 30s, of course, was the Depression. And that Depression was not only statewide, it was worldwide. As far as I was personally concerned, I did not feel any real effects of the Depression, for the reason being that there at home in New Middleton, we always had a garden, and my mother always canned fruits, vegetables, and what have you to carry us through the winter months. We always had our own cow. We had fresh milk straight from the cow. Every year, we always had our own hogs to kill. So we had our meat that was always available. And every fall for a number of years there in the mid-30s, the 6 or 7 or maybe 8 of the neighbors joined together and formed what they called a beef club, where each week a beef would be killed and the meat would be divided up among those people. And we would always have more than we would need, and somehow would be able to run that over just a little bit more. We had a close-knit community, and everybody was a neighbor. I might say this on behalf of my raising there in New Middleton. When we were there, I never remember the front door being locked. When we left the house, I don't remember the front door. I might say the side door. We went in and out what we call the side door. I never remember that door being locked, even though we may be gone for wherever. And of course, we never were gone over one day at a time. So we had a very good neighborhood. My father did not really farm, although he owned a small farm, which he had a tenant. My father started as a happening a merchant. He worked in one of the stores there, and he did that along for several years. But very early in life, and I go back to the 1800s, I had 2 old uncles who were the great uncles, his uncles. They were merchants and traders there in New Middleton, had a store and did trading. They began burying the dead. If someone died in the neighborhood, they were the ones that were called to bury. And at a very early age, he began helping them. He would go with them to the cemetery. And back then, most of the cemeteries were private, family-owned cemeteries. And he would open the gates for them and help fill up the grave and do chores around the house there. So when he married in 1916, he bought the funeral home. He became the funeral director in the community, and then he later went to Gordonsville and my family bought the old Bank of Gordonsville building when it closed in 1931 during the Depression. The bank sold, and he bought the bank. Him and my mother bought the bank, and that became the funeral home, and that is still a part of it today. There's been 2 expansions of the space since then, but the old bank is still there, and just as strong as it ever was, so far as this physical ability to withhold the years are concerned. They built that bank with huge boulders for the foundation. So he owned a small farm, had a tenant there on the farm, and more or less left the farming to him. The war in Europe, we'll talk about that in a minute. The war in Europe started September 1939. At that time, all the news we got was from the newspaper and the radio. The national radio stations such as NBC, CBS, ABC had correspondents in Europe or in England. These correspondents would feed the information back, and actually we could keep up with it pretty much. But we were 2,000 miles away from what's going on. And although I was out of high school right during that period of time, 1939, I finished high school at Gordonsville in May of 1939. I was interested in what's going on, so I would read about it. But we were not in the war, and we were told that we were not going to go to war. It was a European conflict, that we would not be involved. But during that time, the things began to change. We adopted the Lend-Lease policy, where we began to make supplies, and people began to understand that we were not a country way away from what's going on worldwide. We paid very little attention was what was going on in the Far East. And as the Nazi regime continued to expand in the European countries, we began to see that all was not going to be too well, that it would take a miracle if we did not become involved in some shape, form, or fashion. And we became more involved in helping our allies, France, Britain, and to some degree helping Russia in their effort to counteract the Nazis. So I remember the day that the war began. I was listening to the radio, because the news we were getting out of England from the correspondents there indicated that things were not going well. So I was very up to date with news during that period of time, and of course we did get into the war in 1941. I'll talk about that later. So by the time that 1941 came, when we were attacked by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, and Hitler and the Nazis declared war on us, it was not too much doubt that we were in the war. Although we had made little plans to be in war, we were not prepared to go to war. But it was amazing how we all of a sudden began to do things different. The world changed on us on December the 7th, 1941. All of a sudden, we became a mobilized nation. We became a mechanized nation. From the standpoint of materials, we changed from a peacetime nation to a wartime nation. And it is amazing what materials and what machines and what we put out. We went all the way in 4 years' time. We went all the way from a rifle that had been the great weapon in World War II. We went all the way from a rifle through all of the things that could be made right to the atomic bomb. So far as mobilizing for the home front and to get the materials that we needed, everything changed from a peacetime to a wartime. And every company, just about that you can think of, in some shape, form, or fashion, contributed some material, some effort to the war effort. And that's when the women of the United States went to war. They went to the factories and they began to do jobs that no one believed that they could do. And they made the tanks, they made the planes, they made whatever needed to be done. So we mechanized and mobilized, and it took us about 2 years to gain our full strength, but we did it. Now, so far as I'm concerned on my own personal war, I was of the age, as a matter of fact, everybody was of age just about from 18 to 39. They started out 21 to 28, I think, but very shortly they began to change that. And by war's end, it was 18 to 39. I was of the age, and there was no reason for me not to go. Single, doing nothing except going to school, and I did not have any reason not to be a member of the armed forces. I got in the Air Corps. Now, at that time, the Air Corps, which is now the Air Force, the Air Corps was just another branch of the Army, just like the infantry or the artillery. So I was in the Air Corps, and they began to build up the Air Corps, and I was in the Air Corps. I was a radio operator, mechanic, gunner. I had to go to, you take all these tests, and they say, in theory, that you are going to be placed where you are most equipped to be. So, for whatever reason, I was able to put the square pegs in the round holes and do all the gizmos that they required. And I was told that I was uniquely qualified to be a radio operator. So that meant I was going to radio school and learn the International Morse Code. The Morse Code, of course, is di-di-di-da-da-da. And I went to radio school, and I learned how to send Morse code, and I learned how to receive Morse code. And I am indebted deeply to Samuel Morse for being able to develop the Morse code, because otherwise I would have never known what to do with a dit, the da, da, da. But I went through radio school. I went through gunnery school. The gunnery school was to be able to fire and to shoot a 50 caliber machine gun, because back then the airplanes were equipped with 50 caliber machine guns. So I got my training, and everybody in the service had a military occupation specialty. My MOS was a 757. So I went to through school and was assigned to a B-17 bomb crew. We flew B-17s. At the time, the B-17 was the largest bomber that was made. Now, the B-29 came along, and it was much larger. But at the time, the B-17 was the largest. The B-17 had 9 crew members, and I was the radio operator, and also was assigned to a gun. In case of an attack, I got to shoot the gun. So we went through training, and then we were assigned to the 8th Air Force that flew out of England. The 8th Air Force was the largest military unit in the war. The American High Command realized that they had to have a weapon to attack from the air, and what we did, what our assignment was to support the ground troops when they needed some help with some bombardments, to support the ground troops, to attack the industrial supplies of Germany. They were the pioneers in synthetic oil. Before the war, there was no such thing as synthetic oil. They were pioneers in that and built these humongous facilities. We had to knock them out. They had a great rail system. We had to knock out those rail yards. We had to knock out bridges. They were building the rockets, and they had this rocket plant over there, which we tried to knock out. I don't think we ever were too successful. Had to knock out the submarine pens. All of those things were assigned to the Air Force. So I was in the 8th Air Force, and I was assigned to a group over there. It was about 40 different groups over there. And we were busy doing the bombing. During the time I was there, from about late summer 1944 until the war ended in May 1945, the 8th Air Force on any given day could put anywhere from 12 to 1,500 planes up in the air. And they just about did it every day unless the weather kept you from flying. So that was my part of the war. I was involved with the Air Force, and I was just another crew member. Well, after the war in Europe was over, I was sent back, was reassigned to take a refresher course in radio, to be reassigned then to B-29s. But during that time, the atomic bomb was dropped. And I thought back, I don't remember exactly where I was when the word came that the atomic bomb was dropped. I was still in reassignment. I was still in reassignment duties, but how I got the word, I don't remember. But the war ended. If I've got time now to think about my future. Up until now, you did not think about your future because the war is going on and you don't know what's going to happen. Now the war is over, and I had to decide now. And I didn't make a hasty decision, but I made a quick decision that I get out when I can now, and I go back to school. My education had been interrupted, so I decided almost immediately, this is where my war duties, my military is over. I'm going back to school, which I did. And then I came back home and went back to school, got my degree, and went out into the world. And after the war, of course, things had changed. Nothing was the same. The war had been the dividing line between what was and what is now. And after the war, all of these modern conveniences came. The first that I can really think of was the television. Television came to us in about 1951, I guess, early on. We didn't have a lot of television, but we had television. The second thing that came to us, in the mid-50s, the interstate highway system was devised. And it did not get to us until about 1965, 64. But that changed us. And then probably one of the things that has made the most direct impact on most people is the internet, which did not happen until the mid-1990s. Until then, this thing of a cell phone or any of the things that we have now were thought of but unheard of. And I think probably that has caused more change to more people than anything. I have a cell phone in my pocket, and I am told if I went back to try to get my cell phone replaced, I could not do so because it is obsolete. So the cell phone, the internet, all of those things has been a dramatic change. The other thing that I've got to comment on is the fact of the telephone system. Prior to World War II, every community had their own system. 1951 came the big freeze here. We had the big ice freeze, and all of the telephone lines were down. Some systems built back, some could not. But that led to the establishments of what we now have here, the cooperatives. Twin Lakes, DeKalb, North Central, and others in the state. But they banded together and got a telephone system. So with the electric, with the telephone, with the interstate highway going right through the middle, and with the internet, it has dramatically changed our lives. Two things I would comment on. Number one, the big change here in the county. The demise of the small communities and the trading area that each little town had is gone, no longer. And it's not only New Middleton, it's almost every community. There are no stores, or maybe one store left. all of that has vanished. And that was the part of the lifeblood of that community. The interstate highway system and the air transportation has changed the country in a great way. We are now a mobile country. Where it took me, for an example, 4 hours, the very best I could do in the old days from Knoxville to South Carthage, when I got off the Highway 70, 4 hours, and everything had to be good to make it in 4 hours. Now, get on the interstate, you're there in a couple of hours easy. The air transportation, I never imagined that the air transportation would take off like it has, and it has become the medium of transportation here. The other thing that is amazing to me, and it shouldn't be, is, well, two things. One is education. All of the different degrees and subjects now that you can take. Back when I was at UT, for an example, it was a fairly condensed agenda of what you could take, your subjects. Now, not only that, but everywhere, the curriculum is broadened, and almost anyone now who has any ambition at all can find a course of study for them. But I suppose the biggest change that we've had in the whole realm here in our country is in the medical field. Just the advances that have been made, not only in the care and treatment of medicine, but just the research that goes on constantly, and how they continue to try to improve the medical facilities. Of course, back in the early days, no hospital at all. I am now 93 years of age, and thanks be to God, I'm in reasonably good health. I never thought about retiring for whatever reason. So I am still active, although not as active as I used to be. But I can still find plenty of things to do every day. And I do come to the office every day. And I'm in the practice with my son David, who is also the General Sessions judge, and that not being a full-time position, he has his own practice. So I help him do some things. So I try to keep busy, and I do keep busy. And during my lifetime, I've had some pretty good connections. Part of my connections came early on from my practice in Nashville, because I've met some people down there that I've continued with. During the early days of the telephone program, when we were trying to get money to rebuild systems here and to organize what we've got now in the telephone business, Congress was overwhelmed with requests for money. And although they had money available, when you spread that money 48 ways back then, 48 states, it just didn't go around. So I got involved on the level of, let's get money in order to get this job done. And I got involved there on a national level of trying to get more money for the rural telephone program. I believe when I got involved, I believe that Congress had appropriated $20 million for the entire country for telephone expansions. Well, $20 million back then would go a pretty good ways. But you divide that 48 ways, and you don't have any money. So we have, I up until recently, I've worked with that group trying to make sure. And internet is one of the results of that. Almost everybody in the country, here in the county, I'm sure, that has a need for, and doesn't have a need for a cell phone or for some modern conveniences, they have them. I'm still active and try to do a few things every day.